Hi, everyone. Welcome to our recruitment, or rather retention and recruitment. I'm going to put it the right way around webinar, and I'm delighted to be joined. You can see the panelists arriving. We do have, James is unable to join because of a clash, James Sage. So I am joined by two panelists. I'm probably going to join in as well as we go along. So everyone's very welcome. Just before I introduce them, or I'll ask them to introduce themselves, just to confirm for everybody, this is the retention and recruitment benefits, challenges and legal background session, in case you we're not sure which one of professional care workers you are in at the moment. And we are going to take questions. So you may be by now familiar, if you've joined some of the other sessions during the week, that you ideally can use the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on both, or the chat functions. You're probably very familiar with this by now. So either of those two. We do have some topics we know you'll want to talk about. So we've got some to start us off, but please do add any questions in that you would like the panel to talk about. So I am delighted to introduce. Let me go first of all to Jodie Sinclair, and Jodie, would you like to say a little bit about yourself and your background?
Thanks, Neil, and hello to everybody who's joined today, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm Jodie Sinclair. I am an employment lawyer, and I head up Bevan Brittan's employment, pensions and immigration team, and I work across both the independent health and social care sector, but also in terms of the NHS, so seeing the broader picture and both sides of different aspects of similar but not the same. I'm also Bevan Brittan's wellbeing board sponsor, and as an employment lawyer, you know, that's certainly an area that we are seeing more of, and from an employer perspective, in terms of the acknowledgement that that is a really key part in terms of some of the recruitment and retention. But who knows what questions Neil's going to throw at the panel. So but please do feel free to use the chat button, and looking forward to the discussion today, as I said. And thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Jodie. And we did, if you had a screen in front of you, might have seen that we did have briefly, we had Sara Livadeas with us. She has said previously she's struggling a bit with connectivity, so we might find that she'll pop back in. She's currently not here, but I think she's trying to address her connection issue, so she might join. And when she does, I'll ask her to introduce herself. She's got a deep and rich experience in social care. Many of you may know her, and it would be really good to hear her views too. So for those of you that don't know me as well, I'm nominally chairing this panel, but I'm going to dive in as well and join in with Jodie and Sara and talk about some of these topics, because they're my favourite topics too. I have been looking at recruitment and retention of care workers for the last 15 or so years, and in the end I wrote a book about it, now 5 years old, amazingly, called Saving Social Care. Some of the suggestions of how we can fix things. And of course, a lot has happened in the recent past that's generally been mainly headwinds and not tailwinds. So we're going to explore some of those and some of the longer term challenges as well. Now you're back, Sara. I should grab you to introduce yourself, just in case the connectivity goes. Can you hear us okay?
Apologies for being late. So I'm Sara Livadeas, and for those of you that I don't know, I've been working in social care for the last 30 years, both commissioning and operating services. And the last role that I had was Chief Executive of a care home charity, which was also providing supported living to people with learning disabilities. And I'm now freelancing, and as part of that, I'm working for Kreab, which is a PR company, and we're really pleased to be doing pro bono work for the Care Workers charity.
Sara, I think it'll probably catch up with you in a moment, but we got the introduction, so that's great. I think what we should do is probably sort of look at the context of the environment that both providers and care workers are operating in now. And as I mentioned at the top of the session, it's really deteriorated in terms of the amount of pressures that have borne down on the care sector since really before COVID. But I think COVID has accelerated a lot of these challenges, and many providers and care workers are still dealing very much with COVID, on top of a range of more recent factors that you'll be all familiar with around the cost of living crisis and so on. And that is also hitting employers in terms of energy costs, particularly residential providers. So there's a lot of stress in the system, and against this background, we have to try and make the best of recruitment and retention. And so it's a very, very difficult situation, which we, I think, together are going to try and unpick a little bit. Now, Sara, I don't know if you can still hear us. Perhaps not at the moment. So why don't we dive in straight away with and pick a really kind of...
I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, you're there, great. Did you want to give us a little overview from your point of view, Sara, because you're sort of out in the field, and I'll come to Jodie afterwards, just in terms of what you're seeing, the pressures from your perspective out in social care.
Okay, so in terms of scene setting, I agree completely with what you're saying, that it's that post-COVID, care workers have not returned to the profession, and that's been exacerbated, as we know, by Brexit.
I think we've lost Sara mid-flow. I think she's not on the list at the moment. So yeah, Jodie, can I come to you? From your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of the kind of challenges now? I know you mentioned well-being and the risk of burnout. I mean, if you had to pick your kind of top 3 issues, what would those be?
So, and I think just coming back, following on from the sort of question to Sara about the wider context which you've referenced, and I think that's in terms of rising costs for operators and providers more broadly, so supply chain, products, goods and services, the knock-on effect obviously also in terms of the energy crisis, and then of course we've got the cost of living crisis. So there's that sort of increasing costs. So almost the sort of tensions from both sides, from both the employees, but also in terms of the owners and the operators and providers of those services. So I think that then feeds into some of the challenges around recruitment and retention, in terms of, Sara mentioned that a number of staff left the sector during COVID or haven't returned. Now, I think we're seeing that across a number of sectors in England. It's not just the care sector. So I think the pool of working aged people is spread thinner across all markets. So there's that competition there across sectors for recruitment and retention. We've mentioned well-being, and I think that's more of an awareness raising issue, as opposed to, I think that's one of the reasons, or the main reason, that people have left the sector, because I don't think that is the main reason, or the top 3 reasons. And I just think it's generally, it is challenging, just generally. And so people, I wouldn't say we're necessarily seeing an increase in legal claims or employment tribunal claims. I think the sector, it's a very committed sector in terms of what people do. So it's not presenting that way. But I think operationally, it's a sort of, it's a mix of a number of factors, really. And of course, overlaying that is the funding challenges. And we've obviously had a change of Prime Minister. We've got a new health secretary. There's a lack of clarity, but that lack of clarity it isn't new. We're hearing Care England, we're hearing the sector saying there's lots of policies and there's lots of statements, but actually, where's the detail behind it? Where is the workforce strategy? And I think that has a knock-on effect both to providers and operators, but also the employees. What does this mean for me?
Mm. No, absolutely, and I think it's been obviously a time of change in the with the government, and both Secretary of State, and we have a new care minister, and in the background, obviously, there's the sort of move towards ICSs and more integration with the NHS, and you might say that's a good thing because they tend to have a lot more money than we do, and money is clearly one of the challenges that funding, chronic underfunding for the sector has created some of these pressures. And then I think even if we did have the funding, we would still be having a difficult time considering the cost of living crisis, and particularly I think in the home care sector, where you're having to you're running a car and so on, it's and you don't have the same earnings over a 24-hour period as you might do if you were doing shift work, for example, in a residential setting.
And I think on the sort of skills for care did a study or had some machine learning models to identify the main reasons why people have been leaving the sector, and this was in 2021, so during COVID. So there's a COVID related reason there. And going back to your point, Neil, about things have moved on even quite significantly since 2021, coming out of COVID, in terms of some of those increased cost of living and energy, for example, in the recruitment, but better pay outside the care sector. And, we're seeing a lot more. And I think earlier this week, there was a conversation with the work that the King's Fund had done in terms of the comparison of pay within this sector and retail, because we know that they are sort of a main competitor for the workforce. Staff not wishing to be vaccinated, which we're past that, primarily, but also better hours and working conditions outside of the care sector.
Mm.
But the nature of the business and the nature of the client base and the needs that people need, that is not going to change. So actually it's about how can we find a way to make it a satisfying, credible and long-term career to support the long-term sustainability of the sector, because it is so important and so key. And particularly, I think, with that integration agenda with the NHS, and the NHS are sharing staff and they're doing things around shared banks or creating their own banks to address some of the agency challenges, agency cost challenges. And, to the extent that that can or should be done in this sector. But we're still yet to see to what extent the social care workforce will be working more closely as part of that integrated care system. And I think that's going to be potentially a real area of significant change in the forthcoming years.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think we're all finding our feet with the integrated care systems, and they're sort of, in the middle of being formed really now. However, maybe some employers might be fearful of a closer integration with the NHS, because it might mean it's more likely that the staff will consider, working there. And I think pay parity has to be something. If you're integrating more closely, we absolutely would need pay parity with the pay bands in the NHS to prevent an exodus, because it would be illogical to do that with closer integration without doing that, particularly since as we all know, the delayed transfers of care, and so a lot of the pressures on the NHS are due to the pressures in social care. It's one system, and so combining the two in career pathways, I think there's a real opportunity. For example, if you look in Europe, as I have done, then one of the most common job titles there is not care worker at all for the role. It is auxiliary nurse. And there's a very strong pathway, very clear career pathway from a community-based role in what we would call social care and into healthcare, if that's what people want to do. And I think by opening up the top of the funnel, or allowing people to take that path if they choose to, and actually a lot of people from my experience would would choose to stay. The relationship is with their residents and their clients and people they're supporting, and so it isn't the case that everyone will move, but it certainly brings more people into the funnel, into the recruitment funnel, because there are those choices available to them. And I think we can learn a lot from the experience of other countries. Sarah, are you back with us?
I am back. Can you hear me?
Oh yes, crystal clear. Sorry, there was a lag before, but you sound much clearer.
Okay. I've switched onto my phone, so hopefully we've got some better connectivity now. And I'm sorry I've missed what you've just been saying, but there are a couple of things that I could chip in if that would be helpful.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is a survey by Cohesion, who are a recruitment company, carried out a 3-month survey of care teams recently, asking people what was really important to them in terms of their role in social care. And what came out, the top 3 things that they found in the survey was long-term career prospects and job security was number 1. The starting salary, number 2, and number 3 was training and development. And what we take from that is that really it's indicative that people are looking for job security, good rates of pay, a career progression, perhaps more than some of the other benefits that were around earlier on, because job stability at this point in time is really critical. And as we've been saying, for experienced carers, they have a lot of choice in terms of where they work. They can effectively pick and choose, which is great for them. It's a challenge across the board, of course, for workforce. Good news, wages are creeping up, and the average wage for a care worker now is between £10.30 and £10.50 an hour, which is obviously not big money, but it's higher than the minimum wage. And for some providers, they're paying between £12 and £14 an hour. So that's really positive. But
Oh no, we've lost her. Yeah, so she's making a really good point there, Jodie, around, what I mean, if there has been, from the experience I've had with talking to providers, there's definitely been some wage inflation, probably in response to, kind of aggressive actions by alternative substitute employment sectors like the sort of hospitality, retail, and I don't want to use Amazon, but that sort of alternatives that are chasing the same cohort of people. And it may be that providers have run out of steam because it's a regulated sector and they haven't got the capacity to put another £2 onto a pizza on the menu by reprinting it and passing that cost on. We don't have that we can't continue that sort of that competition indefinitely, and probably providers have done everything that they can do at the moment, I would say, barring central government intervention. But if you look outside of that, and what Sara was saying, is that sort of what you're seeing as well in terms of, as an employer, how can you look at your offer and try and at least improve some of the other elements that would make the job quality and the opportunity a greater one?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously there is scope within the contract to make those changes and benefits, and it's very much a commercial decision for operators and providers in terms of what they want to offer. I think there's some really great examples in the sector of imagination and creativity and innovation in terms of what it is often, and looking at the retail sector, which I think is probably the main competitor at the moment. Tesco, for example, I think offers discounts on grocery purchases if you're an employee. So whether or not there's then opportunities to provide lunches and or food support for staff on shifts, whether there's additional annual leave days that set with your service levels. Benefits can be really broad in terms of the cycle to work schemes, all of those things that, a well-being day. You really don't have any limits as an employer in terms of what you can offer or could offer. And I think Cohesion, doing some of that digging down in terms of the key issues is a really helpful starting point. Lots of the conversations, lots of the studies, whether it's the King's Fund, Care England, Skills for Care, the themes are generally the same. Pay, training and development, career progression, recognition. And the job security point, I think, is actually quite interesting, because if we think about the use of 0 hours contracts, and there are many staff in the sector who want that flexibility that the 0 hours contracts provides, but then the flip side argument is that it doesn't provide the job security. And actually, is it about the employer and the employee readjusting the narrative around what is actually needed? Is it about flexibility balanced with some guaranteed hours? Because the sector's got 100,000 vacancies. It's got more employees than the NHS. So clearly there are plenty of jobs in this sector, and finding the right organisation with the right values and the right vision and those frameworks around this is a great place to work. You can frame that discussion around, we want to give you the flexibility. Let's have an employment contract that might have particular contractual benefits in it or not. But it doesn't have to be a 0 hours contract. It can say, well, we'll give you an annualized hours contract. That might be X number of hours, but you can have that flexibility. It's a two-way conversation. And I think there are some great examples already on that. And I think there's some great examples in the sector in terms of what some of those other benefits are as part of that bigger package. And I think it's very welcome. I think the sort of salary war and the war for talent isn't just limited to this sector. And every sector I speak to, and certainly people in different sectors say, well, it can't continue. It can't continue because actually, and I think there's been some other work done around when are people leaving, and it's that retention point in people who've, within the first 6 months or 12 months of joining an organisation. So I think there's something there for employers. It's not about the contractual benefits. It's not about the pay. It's actually making that onboarding and that initial induction piece really credible, genuine, that enables the employee, the new starter, to feel welcome, to feel valued, to be really clear in what their role is, to be integrated into the team, because that's the flight risk in those early stages.
Oh, completely. And I think, yeah, my research has shown, employers tell us that they can lose a third of people that have joined within the first 12 weeks of employment. And that is exactly the danger zone, the flight risk zone. Yeah. And I think, it's and employers can do more to, like you say, offer an environment and a flexibility. Now, generally operations staff don't like offering flexibility because it makes their life harder. But I think that's really a move. There has to be a move towards this. And Skills for Care did some really excellent work in a report called Secrets of Success, which was pre-COVID, but I think the lessons are very, very valuable for all time. And when you asked employers, those were employers with less than 10% staff turnover. I mean, I'm not sure if they still have that now, but they were exemplar employers. And they were asked questions like, what impacts and issues affects recruitment the most for you, and in a positive or a negative way. And the most positive impact that they named was around that their reputation helped them. And of course, that, if you unpick it, is probably where you've been talking, Jodie, about this sort of working patterns, about the leadership, about the support. All of that gives you a reputation in the local community, which through word of mouth brings people in because they're specifically choosing that employer rather than I would like a role in the care sector and I don't really mind who.
I think that feeds into talking about the reputation point, Neil, is also where turnover is lower in services where there are higher CQC ratings in terms of good or outstanding, because there is that, I think it's really an important part of this sector more than others, where the sense of pride and the sense of commitment to the resident and the people that are being cared for is super important, which feeds into the values, but it then feeds into the wider and more important issues around safety and compassion and caring, and then being part of that wider multidisciplinary team. So you have that sort of not just the corporate vision, but you have an individual and collective purpose in terms of what you're doing, and that loyalty. Which is all sort of tied in and interlinked to that bigger picture around providing high quality care. But I think it's also around a very clear process around onboarding and induction. But then, and you've probably done more of this than me on the ground, but the pulse surveys and the constant feedback loops, so that individuals feel listened to because they are bright and they are experienced, and actually in this sector they are an older workforce, and they have probably been in the sector for a long time. There's a large cohort been in the sector for a long time and have probably seen all different examples, from the good, the bad and the ugly, around what works and what doesn't. So actually generating that feedback loop from the employee so that it provides opportunities for improvement or small changes, all part of that bigger recruitment, that bigger retention, and attracting new recruits. And whether or not that is, team huddles or surveys or having conversations, and the manager, who is often incredibly busy and, as you say, juggling huge priorities and wanting to make sure that the roles are covered, but having the conversations with staff at the appropriate times so that they identify where there are potential flight risks, and those issues can be nipped in the bud. Because what we often see when I get employment tribunal claims, one of my questions to clients will be, how did this get to this situation? And when you take a step back and you're looking at the documents of the correspondence, you can almost see where the point was, where the situation could have been remedied. And I think often it's very easy just to sort of get into dealing with the next step, as opposed to taking that step back, the sort of what's going on, how can we help, what can we do, what do you need, and that feedback loop, I think, is super important.
That's a really good point, and I know from experience talking to providers that, and let's take not as far as an escalation to an employment tribunal or a risk of one, but even people making a decision to leave their job, and there are over 100 reasons or factors that might influence a care worker to leave their job, some obvious and some perhaps not so obvious, but and it can be a kind of cry for help, insofar as it could be one small thing, for example, a roster change at the last minute without consultation, and that has, where they said, that's it, I've had enough. And the intervention of, say, the boss or the manager at that point to understand, like, hold on a minute, we can't allow this to happen. If rather than accepting that, oh, well, someone's handed in the notice and there's nothing more we can do, there's often an awful lot more. Because I think if we have recruited well, and from my experience, the majority of care workers have what we would call a calling for care, they're doing the job they love, under difficult circumstances, then, they don't particularly, they wouldn't want to leave to go to a job that doesn't offer the emotional rewards that you would get from supporting or caring for somebody. So it's a tragedy when each one of those happens, I think. But I think you make an excellent point. There is a point at which could intervene. Now managers, if there are any on the call today, probably they're equally under pressure, of course.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to look at what we can do for managers. And do you have any sort of experience of how an employer might be able to support managers? You talked about well-being before, but they're often the single point of failure, aren't they, with all of these pressures kind of concentrated on them?
Absolutely. And I, when I'm sort of doing training or development, and certainly the approach that myself and colleagues take is very much being part of that ongoing learning and reflection, and actually being much more proactive around raising awareness and transferring knowledge and skills and building the knowledge and skills of the manager in terms of understanding the legal framework in which they're operating in. So there's the operational delivery, there's the support to staff, there's obviously making sure that they're complying or supporting the compliance within the regulatory framework, because they are operating within a very clear regulatory framework with CQC. But actually, as you say, that sort of point of the starting point, and quite often when things go wrong, as I say, and I'm sitting here with my legal hat on rather than being an operator or a provider, getting it right at the outset is so important. You may not necessarily agree with the legal framework or what needs to be done, but actually playing that part. So using an example, if an employee has raised a concern, whether it's in a formal letter or whether it's in the form that needs to be filled out, if it's a concern about their employment, it doesn't need to be an overinflated investigation and taking time. It is actually the pause and having those conversations around how can we resolve this, what is the issue. But I think it's also for managers in terms of quite often, what do they not know? Or what do they need to know? And sometimes it's just about the going back to basics. And whether that's around, are the right to work checks in place? Is the contract in place? Does the individual know about where the policies and procedures are? Has the manager actually communicated those? So it's actually having that really clear remit about what's the role of the manager in the induction process? And is the manager supported so that they're passing on the right information? Because at some point, if people are leaving and there's a 36% churn rate, where is the learning to try and minimize that? So I think there's sort of that support, the team huddles. I mean, I think it's really important to have peer support and more broadly networks, and to the extent to which, certainly if there's any attendees on the call, where there are a number of care homes or you're part of a small group, is there an informal support network between the managers? Do you talk to each other? And I think when you've got your head down, focusing on the day job, actually taking a step back in terms of, well, am I having a sense check? Do I have a sounding board? And certainly I think, certainly in my own career, having somebody just to be that sounding board or peer support in an informal framework is actually just as important as the formal. And because when we talk about going back to sort of development and training and career frameworks, I think that's all the soft skills stuff. And I think that's really important. I mean, I actually had a question for you, and if Sara was on the call as well, but I've always been quite interested in terms of, and you made a comment, Neil, about people who work in the sector have a calling and have a commitment and have certain values, which I always find incredibly humbling and inspiring. And certainly when I talk to a number of my clients where, they quite often say, Jodie, I've got no problem recruiting, but actually, we've done the recruiting, but they're not the right, we'd find out they're not the right person. And actually, no disrespect to Tesco or John, they should be working, that's the right job for them. And I've always been quite interested in terms of, so what does the sector do? And is it individual or sector basis in terms of finding those young people through schools or universities who have that calling, and in local communities, is that something that you've seen in your research, Neil, that's what providers and operators are doing to pique that interest at the Duke of Edinburgh stage for the school students who are working in elderly care or learning disabilities? And my sense, not being an operator or a provider, you don't see a lot of PR or messaging around that.
No, it's a really interesting, I mean, it's a topic that has kept me busy for a long time. And I think I've done some work over years asking registered managers to pick their highest performing member of staff that they would like 10 more of. And that's a very easy, hopefully they've got many more than one, but if you force them to choose one, they can, and they immediately think of somebody. And it's very interesting to understand more about that person's journey and story. And so we've been tracking that over a number of years, and there is a very definite pattern of characteristics. So there's the characteristics of the person themselves, and there's also perhaps a trigger event or a reason why they suddenly considered social care. And in the current recruitment market, I think we've been relying far too much on active or formal job seeker sources, internet job boards being a classic one, and they're very important. And there was a very interesting call with Indeed ran a panel yesterday talking about their recent experiences of what's happening in social care, and they are saying that the average clicks for care jobs are down about 20%, even though applications, or rather jobs vacancies, are up about 50%. So that world, it does attract care workers. It tends to be existing care workers going onto a platform like Indeed and typing in care worker to find another role, to develop their career or whatever, for whatever reason. But if you look at what drives, the high performers, wherever they come from, the number one is experience of family care. And this is the number one with younger people under 25-year-olds as well. And they might, let's say, have a brother or sister with a disability. This is a very common story I would hear. Or they have cared for mum or dad, or they were brought up perhaps by grandparents for whatever reason, or had strong contact with an older generation. And that, along with other things that might have happened to them, been brought up in care themselves, or they've had some kind of traumatic event, which all of those things have done is to fast track their emotional maturity. And so when you look at the care sector and look at the average age in the care sector, emotional maturity is one of the characteristics we really have to have. And that doesn't mean it means you have to be older. You do tend to collect emotional maturity whether you want to or not. As you go through life, things happen to you. But those young people that really are the future of our sector, then we would see that they have had those sorts of experiences, and that is really, how do we find those people is, I guess, the challenge that we know who they are. It's just difficult sometimes. On a CV you're not going to put that sort of information because you wouldn't think it was of interest.
That's fascinating. And I guess, though, it's sort of, you want the recruitment pool to be wider, though I would imagine then there's a very important cohort there. But I would imagine there is still opportunities to attract a broader cohort, albeit with that emotional maturity, because that's what's needed. Because I think just looking at the figures from Skills for Care, talking about the challenges around the retention of younger workers, so turnover rate from those aged, that's under 20, so I think that is very young, was close to 40%, compared to about 18% for those aged between 50 and 59. And I think the NHS talked for a long time about the burning platform, and didn't sort of make the changes that were needed. And then, of course, COVID arrived, which was absolutely the burning platform, and the amount of change and acceleration, the accelerated level of change was really quite impressive, whether it was that about digitization, mobilization of staff, different people doing different roles. But you think about the aging workforce in this sector in particular, you know, is that the burning platform for this sector? You know, it's not the pay. It may not be the pay. Is it the aging workforce? But not for now, with 10 minutes left to go. But I think it would be, you know, it's quite interesting when you say you understand what the reasons are, or the people that sort of high performers. How do you replicate that? How do you multiply it? Can you teach it? You know, can you immerse somebody and teach it? I don't know, but I think it's a fascinating stuff.
Yeah, no, I came up with my own workforce plan because there was a bit of a vacancy for one, and actually you look at the roles of you know, central government has a structural role, and there's things that they could do that would, you know, could really help shift things significantly in that direction. Then I think there's a role for the kind of, you know, the regional role of the ICSs, as we were talking about earlier, in local authorities, and what could they do, and then there's what can employers do themselves. And I think that's obviously the near-term opportunity. And in fact, we've had a question in. Thank you, Duncan, for your question. He has made a comment around, you know, who's suited and who isn't suited to care work, and as we were talking about, and you know, how there are many people that don't realize, either they don't know about the sector, they have this calling of like, well, I'm not happy in my job, and actually it frustrates me that recruiters in social care might look at job hopper and say, oh goodness, we don't want a job hopper. Well, they just haven't found their calling. And so Duncan's asking, you know, how would we reach those people, which I posed as a question and we didn't perhaps address. So I'm going to do it now for you, Duncan. And if anyone else would like to add their questions, as Jodie mentioned, we're kind of, we can see the finishing tape, but we've still got more time. So the question would be, how do we reach people when, you know, we can't rely on those traditional sources that we did do? And the answer to that question, I guess, is twofold. There's two main pathways. One would be what we would call passive applicants. So these are the people who are minding their own business and need to be told, nudged, reached, identified. And how would you do that? And passive recruitment sources are the answer to that. And that would include refer a friend schemes. Of course, you know, my work with Care Friends is focused solely on that. Social media, using TikTok now, as well as, you know, the obvious sort of Facebook type platforms and Nextdoor, and it's reaching out into the community in any way you can do it to identify people who are demonstrating their values, and that might be most classically volunteering or something that you could say, you're putting other people first. And it means it's actually harder at the initial stage of recruitment to find those people, but things get a lot easier after that because you found someone with that calling, and they're very, very happy you did, and they do stay. And so that improves our retention. And the other channel, which we might talk about, Jodie, a little bit, I know it's not your particular specialism, but you probably have an opinion, is around international recruitment. And there may be employers on the call here, or there may be care workers who have been born overseas, who have come through as a sponsored employee. And really, you know, do pop on the chat if you are an employer, or you have an opinion or a question about international recruitment, because I would say, before I hand over to Jodie, it's very recently the last Secretary of State issued some guidance in late August saying, we're going to do more to encourage overseas recruitment. And I'm a fan of that, but it does actually run directly contrary with Tory party policy. So we'll see how much traction that gets. But do you have a view on international recruitment? Do you see your clients using it? Jodie, how do you see that world? Is it a big opportunity?
Yeah, I think it is actually, and certainly it's an area that we have certainly seen an increase in since the announcement of the shortage occupation list for care workers was announced in December 21. Obviously, it is only in force for 12 months. I think the Migrant Advisory Committee has been asked to review, but we don't have any indication whether or not that's going to be, well, I don't think it will be extended, but we don't have a definitive position, because it does run counter to the announcement that Steve Barclay did about wanting to extend it. So where are we? And obviously, the very sad events over the last week with Queen Elizabeth's passing, I think the government is quite rightly focused on our period of mourning, as opposed to what is the new Prime Minister going to be doing around all of these unanswered questions, and how are they going to deliver how is she going to deliver the promises. But we are definitely seeing an increase in clients in terms of applying for sponsor licenses, liaising with agencies, doing some of the recruitment themselves. I've been incredibly impressed by certainly a number of the clients we're supporting, in terms of it's not just about the recruitment and the numbers of people that they want to bring over, whether that's a small number or a larger cohort. There's been I'm really impressed by the level of consideration about what is needed to support those international recruits when they come into this new role in this new country, because it's not just about the job, it's about their living, it's about supporting them in terms of getting bank accounts in order to get housing. Where are they in the community? Quite often what we're seeing is actually a lot of referrals, so from international recruits who are then making referrals. So there's a massive network that can be harnessed. Obviously, there is lots of procedures and classifications and steps you need to go through, and it's not always smooth sailing. So I would say there needs to be patience, and actually it's not just about getting people in, it's just not about the numbers, it's actually about that wider support. And I haven't got it with me, but there's been a study talking about the risk of breaching the Modern Slavery Act, and I think there is a real balance between bringing international recruits over, placing them or supporting them in housing, etc., but that support not being holistic, not being well thought of. So there almost becomes that dependency of just all they do is work. And actually you've got to look at the bigger picture. But if you see some of the comments that Martin Green has made when he's been talking about the concerns around agency and the overuse of agency, and saying there are pools of domestic and international workers that could be given permanent employment. So it is all about that story and that attracting people. And I really like your comments about the passive applicants and the use of TikTok and reaching out to people, because I think you can do that with international recruitment as well, because it's about telling your story and the USP, and I think the values of an organization are really important to get across in any recruitment that's being undertaken.
No, completely agree. And I would say from the experience of talking to providers, it tends to be, and it can be quite daunting if you're a smaller provider or employer, is that there's an awful lot of cost and paperwork to navigate your way through, and with some level of uncertainty. And once you've done that, and I think tends to be you have a boots on the ground kind of agency in a country like the Philippines or South Africa or wherever initially, and then what you find is as people come over, and if you treat them well and you do offer this pastoral support and all of those things that you have to do or should do, then things get easier because they will encourage friends and connections to come over, and so employee referral works very well especially in an area where for the employer it's really quite a risk and an expense to bring someone over, and it's equally for the migrant worker too, if it's not the right thing for them and they're be away from their family and so on. So we would expect it to cost a number of thousands of pounds to bring each one over, and so really it's something you're looking at as a long-term commitment. The good news is, of course, that they are not able to be wooed by Tesco or the Amazon warehouse offering a £3,000 welcome bonus because of the terms of their sponsorship, but they could in theory move to another employer in a lower cost accommodation cost area, or they could move to the NHS, of course. So there are risks associated with it, and I think there is an ethical question around pulling this amount of these number of workers from the same target markets in the Philippines and India and South Africa and so on, and certainly other countries are all doing the same thing, and we might find those countries are going to intervene to put a stop to it, of course. So it isn't a strategy we can rely on totally. We are almost at the hour, so I'm going to just ask if anyone, thank you Duncan, if you, hopefully people can see this, has put a link to the risk, the modern slavery report, so thank you Duncan for doing that. If anybody has any other last questions, you're very welcome. We've got a couple of minutes left if you want to squeeze those in. Before we finish, and unfortunately, because it looks like Sara was her connectivity finally failed her, so it's such a shame because she had an awful lot to say as well, but these things happen. So while we're waiting for that to come in, just in terms of the sort of the bigger picture, I guess, Jodie, and looking at sort of recruitment and retention, would you pick recruitment or retention as the bigger challenge at the moment, do you think?
Oh gosh. Well, I think there's something like 100,000 vacancies, but that's not a new issue. I think that was certainly fairly high before COVID, and but there's obviously been the impact of COVID and Brexit, and I think that's a really hard question. I think it is probably 50-50 because there are so many changes in terms of the last 6 months, and it's not just about individuals deciding to leave the sector or to go to a different sector, but I think the retention, because people want that, I think you said it earlier, almost the sort of the psychological contract with who they're working with and for. So there needs to be that, I think in most occasions, the sort of golden thread that this is a two-way relationship. I don't underestimate how difficult it is for providers to recruit. But I think actually don't underestimate also the job is not done just because they've walked through the front door.
Oh, completely. The two things are so, interdependent, aren't they? Because I think, if you don't get the recruitment right, then the retention starts getting worse because people are getting under stress, or you have to, get temporary agency staff in, and all of those issues, costs start going up. But equally, providers often realise that there's more they can do, in terms, they feel there's more control over the retention side than there is over the recruitment side.
I paused when you asked me the question because I thought, oh gosh, I'm going to come across as being one of those lawyers that sits on the fence and doesn't give an answer.
that is the right answer.
But I think when I speak to my clients, and as I said earlier, we can get them in the door, Jodie, we can do that, but actually, it's actually keeping them, and actually our decision about whether we should be keeping them, whether they're the right people. Or they arrive because they decide that's what they want to do, and then actually they haven't got that, whether it's the emotional maturity or the commitment. And you know, the final point I would make also is around, you know, some of the media that you see in terms of advertising. It's more, I think there's a perception about what social care means as a job. You know, when you sort of talk to people about why would you want to work in there, and you know, it's not just about bathing people, you know, or helping them go to the toilet. It is much fuller and rich role in terms of what people do. And I think there's something around that disconnect around perception, possibly, and reaching those young people on the recruitment, but then also the retention around that social media and the TikTok and everything else they use, which I'm not entirely familiar with, but that says more about me than what's out there. But yeah, I think it's a 50-50. I really do.
And I think, yes, I completely agree. And I think to end on a kind of positive, if we can find those people, and there are, I believe, enough people out there that have that calling for care and just simply don't realise it, if it is within the control of the employer to be able to reach those people and make a proposition to them that really speaks to them. And I think that, you know, more people now after COVID are reconsidering, aren't they? You know, they want to do something more meaningful. Well, this is perfect. This is exactly what we offer. It's not an admin role. And I think people are hungry for that. And we obviously need
not packing boxes at Amazon.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think if you have a calling for care, you're not going to spend long in an Amazon warehouse, I wouldn't have thought. So we need those people, and obviously the right level of pay, you know, and respect for the profession is going to take us a long way. But while we're waiting for that, then hopefully you've all heard today some thoughts and ideas about how we can improve both recruitment and retention. So thank you so much, Jodie, for your contribution. And I'll thank Sara. She may be listening in and unable to join us, so apologies for her connectivity challenges. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for your input and your questions. We hope you've enjoyed the session. A big thank you to the Care Workers Charity for Professional Care Workers Week for getting involved. And I'm off to the charity walk tomorrow, and I know lots of your team are too, Jodie. So I'll maybe see some of those people on the call in the Peak District tomorrow. And thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks, Neil. Pleasure.
Thanks.
Everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.